The morning sky over rural Iowa was a patchwork of gold and gray. Mist curled lazily over the cornfields like ghosts, and the low hum of farm machinery whispered in the distance. Among the fields, John Miller adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, squinting at the horizon. He had lived on this farm for 30 years, tending to the land like it was an extension of his own body, every row of corn and wheat etched into his memory. The smell of fresh earth and dew mingled with the faint tang of diesel from his old tractor, grounding him in the familiarity of routine. John wasn't one to notice much beyond the fields, the barns, and the winding country road leading to the nearest town. But today, something in the air felt different. A low vibration shivered through the soil, almost imperceptible, yet it set his nerves on edge. He glanced upward at the sky. Nothing unusual, just clouds stretching lazily across the horizon and the early sun glinting off the Mississippi River in the distance. Meanwhile, at Des Moines International Airport, Flight 228, a commercial passenger plane bound for Chicago, was preparing for takeoff. The plane was a twin-engine jet, filled with 155 souls, each carrying the weight of ordinary life. Business deals, family reunions, vacations, dreams, and anxieties. Among them was a young woman clutching a worn leather notebook, a middle-aged man with a briefcase resting on his lap, and a child pressed against his father's shoulder, mesmerized by the wings outside the window. Flight attendants moved methodically, demonstrating safety procedures, smiles painted on their faces, though a few were distracted by the early tension in the crew room. Captain Richard Hayes, a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience, ran his eyes over the instruments one last time. His co-pilot, Samantha Reed, double-checked the engine readouts and glanced at the sky through the cockpit window. "Smooth morning for a flight," she said, forcing a smile. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and the engines roared to life, vibrating through the cabin like a promise of forward motion. As Flight 228 ascended into the morning sky, the Iowa farmlands receded into a patchwork of green and brown, a mosaic of human toil. Passengers settled into the gentle hum of the cabin. Phones buzzed, children whispered questions, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air. The plane climbed steadily, piercing through low clouds, and for a moment it felt as if everyone on board were suspended in a cocoon of quiet certainty. Back on the Miller farm, John paused mid-step, feeling a strange unease. His dog, Rusty, a graying border collie, growled at the horizon, ears pinned back. Something was coming. He didn't know what, but instinct rooted him to the spot, gaze locked on the distant sky where sunlight reflected oddly off something glinting in the clouds. Inside the plane, the hum of engines was steady, almost hypnotic, until a sudden shudder rippled through the fuselage. A murmur of confusion passed among the passengers. "Probably just turbulence," someone muttered. Captain Hayes' hand tightened on the yoke. "Engine readings check, all normal." Samantha's eyes flicked to the display again, but she didn't see anything unusual. The plane seemed fine, yet the unease that had struck John on the ground now echoed in the cockpit, subtle but insistent. Minutes passed and the plane climbed above 10,000 feet. The sun broke through the clouds, splintering light across the horizon. But then, without warning, the left engine coughed violently and fell silent. A sharp jolt threw some passengers from their seats. Drinks spilled, children screamed, and panic began to gnaw at the cabin. Captain Hayes immediately took control. "Stay calm. We've got an engine out," he announced over the intercom, voice steady but edged with urgency. Samantha Reed's hands moved like lightning, flipping switches and running checklists with precision honed over years of training. But just as the crew stabilized, the unthinkable happened. The right engine sputtered, coughed, and failed. The roar of power vanished, replaced by a deafening silence, broken only by the anxious cries of passengers. The plane was no longer climbing. It was descending, and fast. The beautiful, serene sky transformed into a canvas of terror stretching endlessly beneath them. Flight 228 was a massive metal bird falling from the heavens. Captain Hayes' mind raced. The river, he knew it was below, snaking through the farmland, but was it close enough? Could they make it? Meanwhile, on the Miller farm, John saw the plume of smoke far above the horizon. Something was wrong. The engines. He didn't understand why he knew, only that he did. Rusty barked frantically, leaping and circling his legs, sensing the disaster approaching. John grabbed his truck keys and barreled down the dirt road, leaving the fields behind, instinct screaming that he had to reach the river. Inside the plane, fear had spread like wildfire. Passengers clutched each other, whispered prayers, and stared at the ceiling in disbelief. A child cried for her mother. A man gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles whitened. Captain Hayes and Samantha exchanged a glance that held both despair and determination. There was only one option left: the river below. The descent grew steeper. Airspeed dropped. The ground rushed up closer with every heartbeat. Captain Hayes adjusted the yoke, fighting gravity and physics, hoping that his decades of training could translate into a miracle. Samantha called out readings in rapid succession, her voice clipped and precise, though tremors betrayed her fear. Outside, the Iowa farmland expanded beneath them, peaceful yet oblivious to the chaos in the sky. John's truck bounced over the gravel road as he raced toward the riverbank. He didn't know what he would do, but he had to be there. Something in his bones told him he would matter in the next moments, though he couldn't yet grasp how. The river shimmered in the morning light, calm and inviting, a deceptive sanctuary for the airborne disaster heading straight for it. Passengers screamed, whispered, and prayed as Flight 228 continued its freefall. Captain Hayes' voice over the intercom was calm but tense. "Brace for impact. Everyone brace for impact." The river was getting closer, glinting like silver below the descending metal bird. The wind screamed through the fuselage, whipping loose papers and hair into chaos. And then, as the panic reached its peak, a strange stillness settled over the cockpit. Hayes and Reed shared a silent understanding. They were not trained for this. No emergency manual could guide them through a double-engine failure over a narrow river. Yet amidst the terror, one thought crystallized. Survival depended on something beyond the plane's mechanics: skill, courage, and perhaps luck. Below, John skidded to the river's edge, truck sliding to a stop in the mud. He jumped out, eyes scanning the sky, heart hammering. Rusty barked and circled him, but John barely noticed. The river's calm surface reflected the morning sun, and he prayed that the miracle he hoped for could happen here, in the waters he knew like the back of his hand. The plane loomed above, a monstrous shadow growing larger with every second. Inside, the cabin held its collective breath, passengers gripping each other in silent terror, children staring wide-eyed, and adults whispering desperate apologies and promises. The metal bird was a heartbeat from the water now, engines dead, gravity victorious. John raised his arms instinctively, as if he could somehow guide the descending plane to the river's embrace. Hayes and Reed lined up their approach, scanning for the perfect touchpoint amid panic and chaos. Every second stretched into an eternity. And then, the impossible choice was about to be made. Would Flight 228 survive the water below? Could a farmhand and a river make the difference between life and death? Or was this morning about to etch itself into the annals of tragedy? The plane tilted. The river rippled in anticipation. And for 155 souls aboard, the next heartbeat would decide everything. Flight 228's cabin vibrated with panic. The hum of the engines was gone, replaced by the shrill whistle of wind ripping past the fuselage. Children screamed, parents shouted reassurances that sounded hollow even to themselves. The smell of fear, sweat, perfume, coffee, and stale oxygen hung thick in the air. Every heartbeat felt stretched, elongated into an eternity. Captain Hayes gritted his teeth, hands white-knuckled on the yoke. The instruments were useless guides without power. His eyes scanned the horizon, calculating angles, airspeed, and altitude with only instinct and training to guide him. Beside him, Samantha Reed's hands flew over the controls, toggling switches and flipping breakers in a desperate attempt to coax any power from the dying engines. Sparks flickered in the console, tiny omens of hope. The river below glittered deceptively calm. From the sky it looked narrow, bordered by trees and marshes with barely enough width for a precise landing. Hayes swallowed hard. He knew the plane was too heavy for a water landing under ideal conditions, much less this emergency. But panic was no longer an option. Hesitation could be fatal. Everyone brace for impact. Stay calm, stay in your seats, hold tight. Hayes' voice was firm, but the tremor beneath the words betrayed the gravity of the situation. Flight attendants moved like ghosts down the aisles, screaming instructions to terrified passengers, physically pushing people into brace positions as if their mere presence could anchor the doomed flight. In the rear, a mother clutched her son, whispering that everything would be okay. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, and tears streaked her cheeks. A businessman, usually composed and sharp, muttered under his breath prayers he hadn't said in decades. A teenage girl gripped the armrest until her fingers went numb, staring at the floor, wishing she could disappear. Below, John Miller skidded to a stop along the riverbank. His hands trembled, and he felt sweat prickling at his brow despite the crisp morning air. Rusty barked furiously, running ahead and back, as if warning him to move faster, yet tethering him to the river's edge. The ground shook faintly underfoot as the plane drew closer, the unmistakable shadow of impending doom stretching over the trees. Inside the cockpit, Hayes calculated the impossible. The plane needed to touch the water at a precise angle to avoid flipping or breaking apart. He banked slightly, lining the fuselage with a segment of the river that was widest and deepest. Samantha guided him, her voice clipped with a mix of fear and clarity. Left a little, no. Too far, hold steady. Passengers felt the plane tilt, the wingtips scraping through the turbulent air. A deafening roar of wind filled every corner of the cabin. Drinks spilled, hats flew off, and one man's briefcase slid down the aisle, bouncing off seats like a helpless toy. The turbulence tossed bodies around like rag dolls, some pressing faces to tray tables in panic, others clutching strangers in the hope that human contact might anchor them. The plane dropped lower, water rushing toward them with terrifying speed. Hayes adjusted the pitch. The nose needed to stay slightly up, the plane's belly gliding against the water's surface. One wrong tilt, and they would cartwheel into the riverbank, disintegrating into 1,000 fragments of metal and human life. John squinted against the morning sun, eyes tracing the descending metal bird. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He could see the wings wobbling, the fuselage trembling like a wounded animal. Every second that ticked by felt like a lifetime. He didn't know if he could do anything, but instinct screamed at him that he might, somehow, be a part of saving these lives. As the plane neared the river, Hayes felt the controls stiffen. The hydraulics were failing, airspeed dropping. He whispered a quick prayer almost involuntarily. Samantha echoed it silently, jaw tight, eyes scanning the approaching water. The plane hit the first ripple of wind turbulence over the river, pitching violently. Passengers screamed, clutching each other like lifelines. The mother held her child so tightly he could barely breathe, yet they were connected in that moment of pure terror. John jumped into the shallow water at the river's edge, boots sinking into mud. Rusty barked, running ahead, and he moved instinctively, arms outstretched. There was no plan, only the raw need to reach the water before impact. The river was a silent witness to the chaos above, reflecting the early sunlight while concealing the danger poised to strike. The plane touched the water with a gut-wrenching jolt. Metal screeched, and the hull shuddered violently as it met the resistance of the river. Waves splashed over the nose, cascading into the cabin as passengers screamed in terror. Seats flew forward, papers and personal items scattered like autumn leaves in a storm. Hayes fought the controls desperately, keeping the nose high enough to prevent a catastrophic flip. Samantha's voice cut through the panic, calm and commanding. "Steady, steady, hold it." The words were almost prayer-like, anchoring Hayes as he guided the plane along the river's narrow path. Each second felt eternal, every inch of water a chance between survival and disaster. In the back, passengers felt the plane shudder with each passing wave. Children cried, adults screamed, and some prayed silently. Water began to seep into the lower sections of the plane. Rusty barked from the riverbank, nose to the wind, sensing danger but powerless to stop it. John waded deeper into the river, trying to position himself near the plane's landing path. The riverbank approached faster than any human could process. Hayes tilted the plane slightly, feeling the hull skim across the water, bouncing over submerged logs and debris. Sparks flew as the fuselage scraped rocks in shallow spots. The plane groaned like an animal in pain. Inside, the world was a blur of panic, screams, and splashing water. At the last moment, the plane's nose dipped slightly, then rose, skimming over the final stretch of water with an almost impossible grace. The hull settled with a heavy, wet thud, and the roar of the wind was replaced by the hiss and splash of water under the fuselage. The plane slowed, tilting slightly but stable. Passengers remained frozen, not yet believing they had survived. John stood in the river, mud up to his knees, watching the plane wobble as it came to a rest. Rusty whined, circling him as if to say, "We did it, but is everyone safe?" Hayes let out a long, trembling breath, sweat mingling with the rain of river water on his face. Samantha exhaled sharply, gripping the yoke, eyes wide, heart pounding. Then came the tentative movement inside the cabin. Hands reached out, passengers clutched at each other, crying and shaking, trying to comprehend that they were alive. Children whimpered, mothers hugged them, strangers comforted each other in a spontaneous surge of humanity. The realization slowly settled in. They had survived the impossible. But the danger wasn't over. The river was cold, currents swift, and the plane was vulnerable, trapped in shallow water. Panic still lingered. Escape routes were limited. Lives could be lost in a single misstep. John waded closer, ready to help, his heart racing, eyes scanning the plane for survivors. Above, the morning sun reflected off the water, blinding and serene, a cruel contrast to the chaos that had unfolded. For a brief moment, silence fell over Flight 228, a fragile silence, holding the collective breath of 155 survivors, poised between relief and the realization that the real challenge was just beginning, getting out alive. And then a sudden sound shattered the fragile calm, a creak, a loud snap from the fuselage. Water rushed into the cabin. Passengers screamed anew. John braced himself, knowing the next moments would test every ounce of courage, instinct, and humanity. Would they make it out of the sinking plane? Could anyone survive the river's hidden currents and treacherous edges? Or was Flight 228 still in the grip of danger, teetering between miracle and catastrophe? Water surged through the cabin of Flight 228, icy and merciless. Panic erupted again as the passengers realized that survival didn't end with landing. Seats floated like small rafts, papers and personal belongings drifted past in the cold current, and the groan of the fuselage stressed under the weight of water. The plane, though stable for the moment, was trapped in the river's shallow stretch, held precariously by mud and submerged debris. Every second could push it into deeper water, and every second felt infinite. John Miller waded through the river, boots sinking in mud and reeds, eyes fixed on the plane. He could see passengers at the windows, faces pale, hands pressed against the glass, some waving frantically. Rusty barked and darted ahead, sniffing the water's edge, circling and retreating, unsure whether to enter the cold river. John ignored the biting cold, every muscle taut, and surged forward, knowing he was the first line of help. Inside the plane, flight attendants Maria and Tanya moved with a fierce determination, breaking windows when the doors refused to open fully, guiding passengers toward escape. Water swirled at their feet, icy and threatening, and every motion risked pulling them under. "This way! Move, move, move!" Maria yelled, grabbing the hand of a frightened elderly woman. Tanya helped a young father lift his child through a broken window. Their training was no preparation for the terror in real life. The first wave of passengers slid into the river, screaming and gasping as icy water enveloped them. Many fought panic, kicking and swimming toward the shallows where John stood. He caught a young woman as she staggered out, pulling her to safety, mud and water soaking them both. Around him, more passengers emerged, shivering, crying, and clinging to him like he was a lifeline. Some weren't so lucky. The current tugged at those who panicked, pulling them away from the plane's safety. John dove repeatedly, grabbing struggling hands and dragging people toward the muddy riverbank. Rusty barked and jumped, guiding him toward passengers who had lost their footing. Each rescue was a small victory, but the river didn't forgive mistakes. Captain Hayes and Samantha Reed remained in the cockpit, coordinating the evacuation. Hayes' voice was calm but authoritative over the intercom, guiding passengers toward exits. Samantha worked furiously at the controls, ensuring the plane didn't slide into deeper water. The engines were dead, hydraulics frozen, and yet she manipulated levers and switches as if sheer will could stabilize the aircraft. Sparks flew, and a loud groan echoed through the metal hull as the fuselage shifted slightly, warning of a deeper danger lurking beneath. Inside, a father refused to leave until his daughter was safely out. A teenage boy panicked, thrashing in the icy water. A mother screamed for her infant as water rose around her ankles. Chaos threatened to overwhelm order, yet courage and instinct kept some alive. Each human connection became a lifeline. Strangers held hands, guided each other, and whispered reassurances amidst the screaming. John's muscles burned from exertion, but he couldn't stop. He hauled people from the water one after another, slipping in the mud, feeling the cold seep into his bones. He could see the plane's tail beginning to dip as water pressure shifted against the fuselage. Every second the aircraft remained trapped on the riverbank was a miracle, but the pressure was mounting. One particularly desperate moment arose when a young child became separated from his parents. He floated downstream, screaming, tiny arms flailing against the icy current. John didn't hesitate. He dove, cutting through the water like a human spear, and scooped the child into his arms just before he was swept away. Rusty leapt alongside him, barking as if urging him to move faster. John lunged toward the riverbank, sliding into mud, and handed the child to a waiting parent who sobbed in relief. Meanwhile, Flight 228 groaned under its own weight. The rear section, partially submerged, shifted slightly, sending water surging forward in waves that crashed against the windows and doorways. Some passengers were trapped beneath seats or debris. Hayes and Reed worked feverishly to free them, instructing passengers to push, pull, and climb. Sweat mixed with river water, freezing fingers and numb limbs, but they didn't stop. Every second counted. From the riverbank, John spotted a group of passengers struggling near the fuselage. With Rusty barking and circling, he waded back, extending his hands. Panic threatened to freeze him in place, but determination pushed him forward. He grabbed one woman by her coat, another by her arm, dragging them to shallows where safety existed, even if temporary. Inside the plane, a mother tried to save her elderly father. The man panicked, frozen in fear, refusing to move. Water was rising, and desperation made the air thick with screams. Maria and Tanya guided them through a small window opening, hands strong and reassuring. Each successful evacuation felt like a small miracle, but they knew the plane could shift or sink at any moment. Then a loud crack resounded through the fuselage, a structural beam giving way under the pressure of the water. Passengers screamed anew. Hayes shouted for calm over the intercom, trying to prevent a panic from overwhelming order. Samantha's hands shook, but she held the controls steady, stabilizing the aircraft just enough to prevent further disaster. Every ounce of human skill and instinct was pushed to its limits. John, soaked and trembling from cold and exertion, continued his rescue work. Rusty ran along the water's edge, guiding him, alerting him to passengers who were struggling. Children clung to strangers, mothers clutched infants, and adults supported each other through the icy water. For a fleeting moment, humanity shone brightly in the midst of terror, people risking themselves to save complete strangers. Time seemed suspended. Water lapped at knees, waists, and chests as the river tried to reclaim its hold over the plane. Each new wave tested passengers' endurance. Some cried openly, others stared in shock, their minds unable to process the near-death experience. The river, relentless and indifferent, reminded everyone that survival was fragile and fleeting. Then, as if on cue, the tail of the plane began to tilt dangerously toward deeper water. Passengers still inside screamed. The hull creaked, metal bending under pressure. Hayes and Samantha exchanged a look that held a grim understanding. If the plane shifted further, more lives could be lost. The evacuation had to accelerate. Immediate action was the only option. John sprinted through the river, pulling more passengers from the water, mud sucking at his boots. Rusty darted ahead, barking and circling, urging the remaining people to move faster. Hayes directed passengers from the cockpit, guiding them toward the windows John had positioned himself beneath. Each rescue became a race against time, with the river and the unstable plane as relentless adversaries. In that moment, 155 souls teetered between life and death. Fear and courage collided in the icy water, screams echoing over the river. John, Rusty, Hayes, Samantha, Maria, Tanya, and the passengers all worked together instinctively, a chaotic orchestra of survival. Every second was a gamble, every movement a test of human resolve. And then, just as hope seemed to hang by a thread, a massive shift occurred. The fuselage tilted further toward deeper water. Panic surged. The water level inside the cabin rose. Inside, passengers clung to anything solid, eyes wide with terror. Outside, John and Rusty braced for the worst. Would the remaining passengers escape in time? Could the river and the unstable plane still be conquered? Or was Flight 228's miracle about to collapse into tragedy, claiming the last moments of those still trapped inside? The fuselage of Flight 228 creaked ominously as it leaned perilously toward the deeper section of the river. Water rushed through open windows, surging into the cabin, sending papers, shoes, and luggage swirling like debris in a storm. Passengers pressed against anything solid, hearts hammering, lungs gasping, and eyes wide with sheer terror. The moment of safety had passed. Survival now demanded action. Captain Hayes barked orders over the intercom, his voice the only tether to control. "Everyone, stay calm, follow the crew, move now." His words were confident, yet the tremor in his jaw betrayed the gravity of the situation. Samantha Reed worked beside him, guiding passengers through the narrow windows, stabilizing the plane as best she could. Every second that the fuselage remained upright was a small victory, every shift toward deeper water a looming threat. John Miller waded through the river, mud sucking at his boots, arms outstretched. Rusty barked and darted along the bank, alerting him to passengers who were too far from the shore or struggling against the current. John's muscles burned, water slapping against his chest, but he pressed forward relentlessly. The river was unforgiving, but so was the human will to survive. Inside the plane, chaos reigned. A father refused to leave until his young daughter was safely out. He clutched her tightly, moving cautiously through the icy water. Maria and Tanya, the flight attendants, shoved against the crowd, guiding panicked passengers toward broken windows. Water rose to chest level for some, chilling them to the bone. Every movement risked being pulled under, yet instinct and courage propelled them forward. A teenage girl slipped and fell, face first into the river water pouring in through the window. John saw her struggle, diving immediately, seizing her arm and hauling her toward safety. Rusty leapt ahead, barking as if leading the way. Around them, adults helped each other, forming chains to pull the weaker and frightened toward the mudbank. Captain Hayes kept his gaze fixed outside, calculating angles, distances, and stability. The plane wobbled violently, and every shift of the fuselage sent a new surge of water into the cabin. Some passengers clutched seats, others clung to strangers, and a few screamed in terror, unable to comprehend the nightmare that had become their reality. Samantha's hands flew over the controls, adjusting every lever she could, sparks flickering across the dashboard as if the plane itself were testing her resolve. John grabbed a young mother struggling with 2 children. The current tried to drag them apart, but his strength, honed from years of farming labor, held firm. Mud and water splashed over them, the icy cold stealing breath, yet he didn't falter. Rusty barked furiously, circling, encouraging him, an instinctual partner in this desperate rescue. Inside, the elderly woman who had refused to leave her seat finally made it through a broken window, trembling as she was hauled into John's arms. He pulled her toward shallower water, guiding her toward safety while the plane groaned behind them. Sparks flew from the cockpit, and the tail of the plane dipped further, threatening to slide into deeper water at any moment. Passengers who had made it into the river clung together. Some cried openly, others whispered prayers, and children clung to strangers for comfort. The river, cold and unrelenting, challenged every step, every movement, but human determination burned brighter than fear. Hayes and Reed moved to the rear of the cockpit, guiding the last passengers out. A father lifted his son through a window, water rushing past, waves threatening to pull them under. Samantha steadied them, holding a hand to guide them to safety. Each evacuation was a delicate ballet of strength, timing, and courage. John spotted the last group struggling near the far edge of the fuselage. A young man panicked, flailing in the water, feet slipping on submerged debris. John waded in, catching him by the arm, and pulled him toward the shallows. Rusty barked and ran along the bank, alerting John to others still trapped or struggling. A massive shift occurred in the fuselage. The rear section began to tilt dangerously, sending a surge of water rushing forward. Passengers screamed anew. Hayes shouted over the intercom, directing everyone toward the remaining exit points. The plane groaned, metal bending, threatening to break apart. Every second counted more than the last. Failure now would mean catastrophe. John grabbed a young woman who had fallen into the current, her cries piercing the chaos. He dragged her to the riverbank, mud and water clinging to them both. The woman gasped, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the shock of survival. Around them, other passengers had reached safety, but a few remained inside, frozen in fear or trapped by debris. Captain Hayes and Samantha Reed were the final line. They guided the last trapped passengers through a window near the cockpit, water up to their waists, hearts hammering. Sparks flew across the dashboard, and the fuselage groaned under the strain of shifting water and mud. Finally, the last passenger slid into John's outstretched arms from the window. Relief washed over him, though the icy water and exhaustion still threatened to pull him down. Rusty barked and ran along the shore, circling the rescued, ensuring everyone remained together. John leaned against the riverbank, gasping, shivering, eyes scanning the plane. Flight 228 was half submerged, tail tipping slightly into deeper water, but every passenger had survived. Miracles rarely unfolded with such precision, but the human spirit, combined with instinct and courage, had carved one from the jaws of disaster. Hayes and Samantha remained in the cockpit briefly, surveying the wreckage. The plane had settled precariously in the river, but the people, every soul, had escaped. Hayes exhaled, his hands trembling slightly as he released the yoke. Samantha allowed herself a small, shaky smile, knowing the nightmare was over, though the aftershocks of fear and adrenaline would linger. John helped the last group to the muddy riverbank, shivering from exhaustion and cold. Passengers embraced, wept, and whispered thanks. Strangers had become saviors, bonded by the shared terror and relief of survival. Rusty barked happily, circling everyone, sensing the end of the immediate danger. The river, calm once more, reflected the morning sun in peaceful, indifferent ripples. The plane, silent now except for the groan of settling metal, sat half-submerged, a monument to what had nearly been a disaster. But humanity had prevailed. Courage, quick thinking, and sheer determination had transformed a potential tragedy into a story of survival. For 155 souls, the river had become both a grave and a sanctuary. For John Miller, It was a testament to instinct and action, the ordinary farmer who had become a hero. For Captain Hayes and Samantha Reed, it was the culmination of years of training, skill, and unyielding resolve. And for everyone on board, it was a day they would never forget. But even as the adrenaline faded, questions lingered in the minds of survivors. How had they escaped what seemed inevitable? Was it luck, skill, instinct, or something else entirely that had saved them? And as they huddled on the muddy riverbank, shivering, soaking, and exhausted, the river's calm surface seemed almost mocking, hiding the dangers they had just survived. No one spoke at first. Silence fell, punctuated only by the soft lapping of water and the distant calls of birds. Then gradually murmurs of gratitude, disbelief, and awe began. Survivors helped each other to their feet, supporting the injured and consoling the shaken. John Miller looked at the group he had saved, Rusty at his side, and felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. But deep inside, a tension remained. The plane was still in the river, precarious and unstable. Emergency crews had yet to arrive. Cold and exhaustion weighed heavily, and the survivors knew that while the immediate terror was over, the ordeal was not quite finished. And somewhere in the back of the mind of every survivor, one question burned. Had they truly escaped death, or had fate only postponed it? The morning sun climbed higher, shimmering off the muddy waters of the river, reflecting a serenity that belied the chaos that had just unfolded. Emergency sirens wailed faintly in the distance, signaling the arrival of first responders. John Miller, shivering from cold and exhaustion, helped passengers move further up the bank, away from the half-submerged fuselage. Rusty barked happily, circling, seemingly proud of the lives they had saved. Paramedics and firefighters arrived, racing against time. Stretchers were deployed, blankets handed to shivering survivors, and EMTs moved swiftly to assess injuries. Some passengers had minor cuts and bruises, others were hypothermic or in shock, their bodies trembling uncontrollably from hours spent in icy water. John assisted where he could, guiding people, helping carry children, and providing calm reassurance amidst the controlled chaos. Captain Hayes and Samantha Reed emerged from the cockpit, soaked and exhausted, greeted by first responders who quickly checked their vitals. Both were trembling but alive, a mix of adrenaline and relief coursing through them. Hayes muttered a quiet thanks to the river and to instinct, while Samantha's gaze swept the riverbank, still haunted by the possibility that someone could have been left behind. Paramedics loaded passengers into ambulances, murmuring reassurances and directing the more stable survivors to the roadside for warmth and blankets. Survivors huddled together, shaking, some crying in relief, others too overwhelmed to process the ordeal. John sat on a fallen log, exhausted, covered in mud and water, Rusty curling up beside him. He watched the scene, heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with the surreal realization that he had helped save lives. A journalist from a local news outlet arrived, camera in hand, recording footage and interviewing first responders. "How did this happen?" she asked a firefighter as helicopters circled above. Hayes and Samantha stayed silent, focusing on the wounded. They didn't want to recount the near-death experience yet. The memories were raw, the adrenaline still gripping their minds. A young mother sat on the bank, cradling her infant, tears streaking her face. She whispered softly, thank you for keeping us safe." John approached, offering a nod and quiet reassurance, unsure if words could convey the emotions in that moment. Around them, survivors comforted one another, forming impromptu families of shared terror and relief. Medical personnel attended to injuries, knotting bruises, minor fractures, and hypothermia cases. One elderly passenger, still trembling violently, was stabilized by paramedics before being placed into an ambulance. Each rescue felt like a victory, but every patient reminded those on the riverbank that survival had come at a price, not yet in life lost, but in physical and emotional trauma. The plane itself remained partially submerged, a jagged silhouette in the water. Hayes walked toward the fuselage, surveying the damage. He ran a hand along the warped metal, remembering the descent, the tilt, the frozen moments when death had been an almost tangible presence. Samantha joined him, both silently acknowledging the miracle that had saved 155 lives. Yet, even in that relief, unease lingered. The plane was unstable, and the river could reclaim it at any moment. Meanwhile, local residents arrived, drawn by the commotion and emergency sirens. Some brought blankets, towels, and hot drinks. Others simply watched in awe, whispering prayers and shaking their heads at the improbable survival. One farmer standing near the riverbank muttered, "I've seen floods, wrecks, and storms, but nothing like this." John nodded silently, exhausted, still trying to process what had just occurred. Rescue helicopters hovered above, assessing the situation, ensuring the riverbank was clear, and surveying the plane's precarious position. Authorities coordinated with local emergency crews, planning the extraction of the plane in a way that wouldn't endanger the survivors still on the bank. Hayes and Samantha provided technical details to responders, outlining the plane's weight, position, and stability issues. Amid the organized chaos, a reporter approached John, nodding his mud-streaked clothing and calm demeanor. "Were you one of the rescuers?" she asked. He shook his head, too exhausted for words, but she snapped a photograph anyway, capturing him standing beside Rusty, a figure of quiet heroism amidst the crowd of survivors and emergency personnel. Some passengers struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Conversations broke out in fragmented phrases, parents clinging to children, teenagers holding hands, and strangers sharing stories of how they had survived the terrifying descent and icy river. Some murmured disbelief. How had they landed safely? How had a farmer, seemingly ordinary, played such a vital role? And why had every single person survived when the odds had been stacked so heavily against them? Paramedics continued moving through the crowd, checking vitals, stabilizing the hypothermic, and escorting those needing further medical care to waiting ambulances. The survivors' emotional exhaustion matched their physical fatigue, and the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. Many collapsed onto blankets, sobbing quietly or holding loved ones tightly, silent tears of relief and trauma blending into the crisp morning air. News helicopters transmitted live footage, showing the plane resting in the river, surrounded by emergency crews and survivors. The story quickly began spreading across social media, headlines splashing the miraculous survival. 155 survive after plane crash lands on Iowa River, and farmer saves dozens in river landing miracle. People across the nation paused, captivated by the improbable tale of courage and survival. John Miller, exhausted yet alert, kept Rusty close and helped coordinate small groups of survivors to ensure everyone received warmth, blankets, and food. Hayes and Samantha briefed authorities, detailing what had happened in the cockpit, the failures of the engines, and the split-second decisions that had saved lives. Each retelling felt surreal, as though the events had occurred in a dream too vivid to be real. As the day progressed, emergency crews began stabilizing the plane further, securing it to prevent shifting. Authorities coordinated transport for those in need of medical attention, while news crews continued documenting the astonishing rescue. The scene, once a nightmare, had transformed into a testament to human courage, resilience, and the unpredictable forces of fate. But even in the relief, tension lingered. The plane still rested in the river, precarious and damaged. Questions remained. What caused both engines to fail simultaneously? How had they escaped when the odds were overwhelmingly against them? And most pressing, how would the survivors process what they had just endured? The river had spared them, but the psychological scars would last far longer than the bruises and cold water. John leaned against a tree on the riverbank, Rusty at his side, watching the scene unfold. He had been an ordinary farmer that morning, tending his fields. Now he was a hero, part of a story that would be retold for years. Yet he felt no pride, only exhaustion and the quiet weight of responsibility. He had been at the right place at the right time, and his actions had mattered. But the world would likely never understand the fear, the seconds that stretched like hours, or the adrenaline-fueled terror of guiding strangers from icy water to safety. Passengers began sharing stories, recounting the moments when courage overcame fear and when panic was transformed into survival instinct. Friends hugged, strangers held hands, and families reunited amidst the muddy riverbank, each face a mixture of disbelief, relief, and gratitude. The miracle of Flight 228's survival was not just in the landing, it was in the human spirit that had risen to the occasion. But even as emergency crews cleared the scene and survivors were transported to nearby hospitals or warmed at the roadside, a lingering sense of unease remained. Questions about the plane's failure, the near-miss disaster, and the fragile line between life and death gnawed at everyone present. And in the background, the river flowed silently, indifferent and eternal, a reminder that even miracles had limits, and that the balance between survival and tragedy had once again been decided by courage, instinct, and the unlikeliest of heroes. The day after the miracle landing, Des Moines was alive with a mixture of awe, curiosity, and speculation. News helicopters circled the river once again, broadcasting images of the partially submerged Flight 228, muddy and battered but upright. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Miracle on the River and Farmer Hero, capturing national attention. Every news outlet wanted the story, and every journalist demanded answers. How had 155 people survived a twin-engine failure over a narrow river? And who was the farmer that seemed to have guided them to safety? John Miller, still sore, cold, and sleep-deprived, returned home to a quiet farm that seemed impossibly mundane compared to the chaos of the previous day. Rusty lay at his feet, eyes following every movement as if he understood the enormity of what had occurred. The phone rang constantly, journalists, neighbors, distant relatives, but John kept it at arm's length. Fame was foreign, uncomfortable, and yet unavoidable. Meanwhile, at Des Moines International Airport, federal investigators had descended on the scene. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, began meticulously documenting everything: the plane's final resting place in the river, engine readings, maintenance logs, and eyewitness accounts. They photographed the twisted fuselage, measured the depth of water, and questioned passengers and crew alike. Every detail mattered, as they sought to determine why both engines had failed simultaneously, a near-impossible scenario in commercial aviation. Captain Hayes and Samantha Reed were summoned for extensive interviews. Hayes, his hands still slightly trembling from fatigue and lingering adrenaline, recounted the sequence of events with clinical precision, occasionally pausing as memories of the terrifying descent surged back. Samantha's account was equally detailed, her calm professionalism belying the internal fear she had felt as the plane fell from the sky. Investigators pressed for every detail: the speed, the angle of descent, the maneuvers they had attempted, the crucial timing that allowed the plane to skim the river rather than plummet into farmland. Passengers were also interviewed, many still grappling with shock. Their accounts were vivid and emotional, detailing the icy water, the chaos inside the cabin, and the courage displayed by flight attendants and by John Miller, who had become a focal point of every narrative. Eyewitnesses described how he had waded into the river repeatedly, pulling strangers from the current and guiding them to safety. The idea of a lone farmer influencing the survival of 155 people captivated investigators, journalists, and the public alike. News outlets turned John into a reluctant celebrity. Footage of him covered in mud, arms outstretched, rescuing passengers was broadcast across national television. Social media exploded with admiration, speculation, and questions. Who is this man? How did he know to be there? John, unused to attention, brushed off praise, insisting it was instinct, luck, and the dog that had guided him to act. Yet the public wanted a hero, and John unwillingly became one. Investigators discovered that a rare mechanical failure had caused the engines to fail almost simultaneously. A malfunction in the fuel control system, coupled with an electrical anomaly, had triggered the twin-engine shutdown at cruising altitude. The scenario was so improbable that it bordered on theoretical, yet the cockpit data proved it had occurred. Hayes and Reed's training, quick thinking, and split-second decisions had transformed a statistical catastrophe into a narrowly avoided disaster. Public hearings and press conferences followed. Hayes, Samantha, and John were asked to recount the events in meticulous detail. Hayes spoke of the river, the calculations, the maneuvers, and the precise timing required to keep the plane stable. Samantha discussed the technical side, her fingers still twitching as she mimicked the adjustments that had kept the aircraft from tipping into deeper water. John simply described what he had felt: the instinct to act, the need to reach the river before disaster struck, and the surreal clarity of knowing that every second mattered. For many passengers, the psychological toll became apparent. Survivors reported insomnia, flashbacks, and emotional instability. The trauma of nearly dying, combined with the bizarre circumstances of the landing, left a lingering shadow. Therapists were brought in, hospitals offered counseling, and families struggled to help their loved ones navigate a reality that had suddenly become fragile. Some survivors developed phobias of flying, others became intensely protective of their children. The miracle landing had saved them physically, but emotional scars remained invisible yet profound. John, too, faced his own inner turmoil. While he had acted instinctively, he replayed every moment in the river repeatedly, questioning whether he could have done more, whether someone might have slipped from his grasp. His nights were restless, haunted by faces of those he had rescued, and even by those he couldn't reach fast enough before they were pulled downstream by the icy current. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by the quiet anxiety of reflection. Authorities began examining how the miracle landing had occurred with such minimal casualties. The plane had touched down on a precise stretch of river, shallow enough to prevent full submersion but deep enough to cushion the fuselage. Hayes' calculation of the angle of impact, combined with Samantha's technical adjustments, created a perfect convergence of skill and circumstance. And as the investigators repeatedly noted, John's presence at the riverbank had been critical in guiding passengers to safety once the plane hit the water. Yet even with praise and media attention, John remained grounded in humility. He often returned to the river, looking at the water that had been both a grave and a savior. He walked among the reeds, boots muddy, rusty at his side, reflecting on the randomness of life, the fragility of human existence, and the extraordinary ways ordinary people could be thrust into moments of heroism. The country watched, captivated by the story. Social media users shared animated reconstructions of the landing, graphic analyses of the maneuvers, and personal testimonials from survivors. Talk shows debated how training, instinct, and luck combined to prevent tragedy. The story spread beyond Iowa, beyond the United States, inspiring awe and discussions about fate, courage, and the resilience of the human spirit. Yet questions remained unanswered. Could this have been prevented? Would regulators implement new safety measures to ensure no other twin-engine failure could threaten lives in the same way? And most poignantly, how much of Flight 228's survival was sheer luck, and how much was the instinctive heroism of a farmer who happened to be in the right place at the right time? In quiet moments, John reflected on the impossibility of the morning. His fields had never seemed so ordinary, yet so miraculous. Rusty rested his head against John's leg as he stared at the distant river, calm and indifferent once more. The plane had transformed from a deadly machine to a monument of survival, and yet the river itself remained unchanged, silent, impartial, and eternal. As investigators continued their work, the survivors began to rebuild their lives. Emotional wounds healed slowly, but the bonds forged in the river's icy grip endured. Passengers who had been strangers now exchanged letters and visits, bound by shared trauma and gratitude. Hayes and Samantha received accolades, commendations, and national recognition, yet privately, they knew the true hero was the farmer standing quietly in the background, never seeking credit, always focused on the next person to reach safety. And for the nation, the story of Flight 228 became more than a miracle landing. It became a testament to courage, instinct, and the unpredictable ways ordinary people can change the course of life and death. Yet even amid heroism and relief, one lingering thought haunted everyone involved. Would they ever fully understand the fragile line between catastrophe and survival? Or would the river, silent and eternal, remain the final arbiter of fate, holding secrets that only those who survived could glimpse? The story of Flight 228 dominated headlines and social media feeds across the country. News networks ran continuous coverage, replaying the landing, the river, and the astonishing rescues. Hashtags trended: River Landing Miracle, Farmer Hero, Flight 228. Analysts debated every detail: the mechanics of the landing, the split-second decisions, the odds of survival. The public was mesmerized. Ordinary people loved heroes, and John Miller had become the embodiment of courage and humility, the farmer who had saved 155 lives without hesitation. John tried to return to normal life, but normal felt impossible. His fields, usually his sanctuary, now seemed small and trivial against the enormity of what had happened. Neighbors stopped by, bringing food and congratulations, but he waved them off politely. Fame had found him, yet he resisted it, feeling awkward and unworthy. His mind was still replaying the river, the icy water, the faces of those he had pulled to safety. Every movement in the wind reminded him of screams. Every shadow of the riverbank reminded him of lives hanging in the balance. Rusty became an overnight sensation as well. Videos of the dog running along the riverbank, barking to alert John to struggling passengers, went viral. People marveled at the loyalty and intelligence of the ordinary farm dog who had helped save lives. Rusty, oblivious to fame, simply wagged his tail, enjoying the attention while guarding the farm with the same vigilance he had shown in the river. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes and Samantha Reed were honored for their role in the near-impossible landing. Medals were awarded, speeches delivered, and interviews conducted. Yet both remained haunted by the morning. Hayes had experienced hundreds of flights, but nothing compared to the split-second decisions he had made that day. Samantha, who had executed precise technical adjustments to keep the plane from tipping into deeper water, wrestled with the knowledge that a single miscalculation could have cost every life on board. Public recognition brought accolades, but private fear lingered. John, though reluctant, was eventually approached by news outlets for interviews. Cameras, lights, and microphones surrounded him, but he kept his answers short and unembellished. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said repeatedly. Yet the nation refused to accept modesty. They saw a hero in his boots, hands caked with mud, standing alongside Rusty as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The line between humility and legend blurred. Some survivors sought him out personally, hugging him, tears streaming down their faces. One mother, clutching her child, whispered through sobs, "You saved my son, I don't know how to thank you." John's throat tightened, emotions he had suppressed for days surfacing in full force. He managed a nod, a quiet smile, feeling the weight of responsibility more keenly than any praise. Rusty nudged his leg, reminding him that the world could wait. The river had demanded action, not glory. Yet even in the midst of praise, shadows lingered. John couldn't forget the faces of those who had panicked, those he had almost lost. Each time he closed his eyes, the river returned, cold, fast, indifferent. He walked the fields alone, sometimes talking quietly to Rusty about decisions he had made instinctively. The media called it heroism, he called it necessity. But necessity, he realized, often carried the same weight as fate. Investigators continued their work. The NTSB released preliminary reports, confirming mechanical failure and praising the actions of Hayes, Reed, and John. Yet there were whispers of luck and miracle, phrases John found unsettling. Luck was uncontrollable, fleeting. Miracle implied divine intervention. He preferred instinct, skill, and the willingness to act when seconds counted. The world celebrated the outcome, but he knew the razor-thin margin that separated survival from disaster. Meanwhile, survivors shared stories with each other, forging unexpected bonds. People who had been strangers hours earlier became lifelong friends, united by trauma and relief. Letters and phone calls poured in, some simply thanking John, others sharing personal stories of hope renewed, lives reconsidered, and perspectives forever changed. Many admitted that the near-death experience had shifted priorities, strengthened relationships, or inspired new courage in their own lives. Yet not everyone could process the aftermath easily. Some passengers experienced nightmares, flashbacks, or irrational fear of water or flying. Children who had been in the aisles cried unexpectedly. Parents struggled with anxiety attacks. Psychologists called it post-traumatic stress, emphasizing that the emotional impact often lasted far longer than physical injuries. Even John found himself sleepless, staring at the ceiling, replaying the river, the plane, the frozen moments of terror. National leaders took notice. Letters of commendation arrived at John's farmhouse, and a private invitation from the governor to recognize his heroism was extended. Hayes and Samantha were invited to speak at conferences, their story becoming a case study in aviation schools nationwide. Yet John declined formal ceremonies, insisting his role had been instinctual, not heroic, though the nation disagreed. The paradox weighed on him, being celebrated while feeling the stark reality of what had nearly been lost. Rusty remained the quiet witness to John's struggles. The dog would sit at his side during long nights, eyes alert, sensing the tension his owner carried. Sometimes, when John walked along the riverbank at dawn, he would pause, reflecting on the calm water that had hidden danger, on the frozen panic of passengers, and on the extraordinary way ordinary lives intersected with fate. The public's fascination only grew. Documentaries were proposed, news specials produced, and social media accounts celebrated the miracle landing. Flight 228 became shorthand for courage and improbable survival. But for those who had lived it, the story was never simple. Trauma, gratitude, fear, and awe intertwined. Each retelling was both cathartic and agonizing, a reminder of the razor-thin line between life and death. One evening, after the cameras had gone and the river had returned to quiet reflection, John sat on the bank with Rusty. The wind whispered through the reeds, birds called softly, and the plane remained partially submerged, a silent monument to survival and chance. John whispered aloud, almost to himself, "We were lucky, or maybe we just had to be brave." Rusty nudged his hand as if agreeing. And still questions lingered. Could this have happened to anyone else? Would the river's calm ever hide such terror again? And in the quiet moments when the adrenaline faded and the world demanded explanations and accolades, John realized that the true weight of heroism was not in recognition, but in the quiet aftermath. The memories, the trauma, the lives saved, and the lives forever changed by seconds that could not be reversed. As the nation celebrated, as the survivors healed in pieces, and as the story spread worldwide, one question remained unspoken but heavy in the hearts of all who witnessed or lived through it. Had Flight 228's miracle been purely chance, or had it been the extraordinary result of courage, instinct, and humanity acting in perfect alignment under impossible pressure? Weeks had passed since Flight 228's harrowing river landing. The story had faded from front-page headlines, but remained alive in the hearts of those who survived. Survivors attended therapy sessions, support groups, and reunions organized to process trauma and celebrate survival. The river itself had returned to quiet normalcy, the surface smooth and indifferent, hiding the chaos that had unfolded beneath. It had claimed nothing, yet it had tested everything. John Miller returned to his farm, the crops swaying gently in the breeze. To outsiders, it seemed like a return to mundane life. But for John, everything had changed. Every sunrise reminded him of the icy water, the faces of terrified strangers, and the responsibility he had shouldered. He still woke some nights drenched in sweat, replaying moments when a single misstep could have turned heroism into tragedy. Rusty remained at his side, ever vigilant, ever present, a reminder that instinct, loyalty, and courage could transcend ordinary expectation. Captain Hayes and Samantha Reed resumed flying duties, though each takeoff carried a shadow of the river in their minds. For them, every pre-flight checklist was layered with experience, every decision informed by the awareness that survival sometimes depended on the slimmest margin of judgment. Yet both acknowledged that the landing had not been solely a product of skill. It had been the convergence of training, timing, and circumstance, with the farmer's courage tipping the scale. The NTSB released its final report months later, confirming the near-miraculous landing was the result of mechanical failure combined with exceptional human response. Recommendations were issued to prevent similar engine malfunctions, and new training protocols were implemented for pilots to prepare for rare twin-engine failures. Flight 228 became a case study in aviation schools worldwide, an example of how preparation, teamwork, and calm under pressure could transform catastrophe into survival. Yet the official recognition, commendations, and accolades could never fully capture what had occurred. Survivors carried the memory of icy water, twisted metal, and the chaos of panic alongside gratitude for those who acted decisively. They spoke of John Miller not as a celebrity, but as the embodiment of instinctive heroism, an ordinary man whose courage had bridged the impossible gap between life and death. John's humility remained unshaken. He did not seek public attention, though occasional letters arrived from strangers thanking him for his role in the rescue. Some offered gifts, others invited him to speak at events, and many simply expressed awe. Yet John declined invitations, choosing instead to walk his fields, tend to his crops, and reflect quietly on the extraordinary events of that morning. Rusty ran alongside him, ears perked, tail wagging, a companion who had shared in the ordeal and now shared in the quiet aftermath. The survivors, too, found ways to honor the day. Families kept photographs of the river, sketches of the landing, and mementos from the fuselage. Support groups shared stories, chronicling not only the trauma but the triumph of human courage. Children spoke of the river as a magical place, where ordinary people had become heroes, and parents taught lessons of bravery, compassion, and quick thinking that would echo for generations. Yet even in reflection, questions persisted. Could it happen again? Was survival always this fragile, dependent on instinct, timing, and the courage of strangers? And for John, each question carried the weight of responsibility, the quiet knowledge that while heroism could save lives, it came with the burden of memory and reflection. One crisp autumn morning, John returned to the riverbank, Rusty trotting ahead. The plane had long since been removed, dismantled, and studied by investigators, leaving only mud and reeds behind. He knelt by the water, letting his hand brush the surface. The river was calm, indifferent, yet it held a silent power, a reminder of what had occurred. John whispered softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "We were lucky, and yet somehow we did what we had to do." In the distance, a young couple approached, holding the hands of a small child. The mother smiled, whispering something about courage and heroes. John nodded, eyes drifting to Rusty, who barked once, then returned to sniffing the riverbank. The scene was ordinary, yet layered with extraordinary memory. Life had returned, yet the story of Flight 228 remained etched into the hearts of everyone who survived. Captain Hayes and Samantha Reed visited occasionally, quietly acknowledging the riverbank that had saved lives. Together, they reflected on what had transpired, not just the landing, but the unspoken bond between ordinary and extraordinary people, between fear and courage, and between life and the thin line that separates it from catastrophe. Time passed, seasons changed. The river remained as eternal and silent as ever, bearing witness to the human drama that had unfolded upon its banks. Survivors went on with their lives, children grew, and John Miller continued to tend his farm. Yet the story endured, not in headlines or accolades, but in memory and human connection. And though the nation would remember John Miller as the farmer who saved lives, he knew that survival had not been about one man, one dog, or even one decision. It had been about courage rising instinctively in the face of impossible odds, about strangers helping strangers, about instinct, skill, and the human spirit refusing to yield to fear. Years later, Flight 228 became legend, a story told in classrooms, on documentaries, and around kitchen tables. And though the plane was gone, the river still flowed, calm and indifferent, holding within its quiet waters the memory of the day 155 lives had been saved, of heroism born in the midst of chaos, and of a farmer whose courage became timeless. In the end, Flight 228's legacy was simple yet profound. Ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can rise to do the impossible. And sometimes, fate aligns with courage, creating a miracle that survives far beyond the river, far beyond headlines, and deep within the hearts of all who witnessed or lived through it. As John walked along the riverbank, Rusty at his side, he knew one truth. The world would never forget that day, but he would carry it quietly, in memory, in humility, and in the unspoken bond between a man, his dog, and the lives they saved. The river flowed onward, as it always had. But for those who survived, and for those who acted without hesitation, nothing would ever be ordinary again.